Welcome to Insights, a Canadian Journal of Political Science podcast. I'm your host, Liddell Hastings, with technical support from Abel Amba. Today we are joined by Clark Banack to discuss his article, Ethnography and Political Opinion, Identity, Alienation, and Anti-establishmentarianism in Rural Alberta. Insights by the CJPS can be found on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. To keep up to date on the CJPS, please follow us on Twitter at CJPS_RCSP. Welcome to another episode of the CJPS podcast. Today we are joined by Clark Banack, and we're discussing Alberta, rural identities, and kind of populism and the politics of resentment. I usually start off with, what drew you to this area of research, what inspired you, and kind of take us along that kind of journey of what started you for, writing on these types of topics.
Yeah. Well, so I am originally from rural Alberta. I went off to grad school in Vancouver at UBC, and then my first job took me to Toronto. I worked at York University for a number of years. And in 2017, essentially for family reasons, my wife and I chose to move back to rural Alberta. It was just something we really wanted to do. It was a goal we had. So I ended up back in rural Alberta in 2017, and I found work with a research center at the University of Alberta called the Alberta Centre for Sustainable Rural Communities. This is the center that I'm now the director of. But back in 2017, I was just kind of a lowly research associate. And this position gave me some latitude to think about rural questions. Up until that point, as a political scientist, I'd done quite a bit of work around populism and conservatism in Canada and Alberta, and especially religion and politics. I wrote a book that came out in 2016 about, religion and Alberta politics, over a century. And in fact, I have another book coming out very shortly with Jim Varney on the politics of religious education in Canada. So that was kind of my first my first professional area of work. So this coming back to rural, and as a rural citizen, it was kind of something new to think about these kind of rural questions through kind of my political science lens. Although I'll admit that the first question I was actually most interested in was not necessarily a political science type question. Rather, I was interested in exploring what effective anti-racism programming or effective Indigenous reconciliation programming might look like in a rural context. I've been a participant in a number of different anti-racism programs that rely on concepts and terminology that, to be frank, seem to fit better in a graduate seminar sometimes than they do in kind of any authentic on-the-ground context, and especially a rural context. So I was interested in thinking about, a type of program that would actually, what kind of program, or what would a program look like that actually took rural seriously and could speak a language that rural people would understand and buy into. And while I was thinking about this particular question, I encountered this book by Kathy Kramer, The Politics of Resentment. And this was published in early 2016, and it gained a lot of attention really for two reasons. One, it highlighted really for the first time the existence and shape of a rural-based political resentment. And she was able to draw attention to this and explain it in a helpful way just prior to this really exploding on the scene with the election of Donald Trump in 2016. And, since then there's been a lot of attention paid to kind of rural political opinion and resentment-based populism. But it was really Kathy Kramer's work that really kind of, first brought it to kind of the fore in a serious way. So that's one reason why the book gained a lot of notoriety. But maybe even more important, the book gained a pretty widespread audience because of the methodology she employed. She called it a political ethnography, which was for her the process of embedding herself in regularly occurring coffee shop conversations with groups of acquaintances and just listening to them talk about politics. And, I admit reading this book, this got me really excited right away, this approach. it felt both so sensible, but also kind of a bit revolutionary, related to kind of traditional ways we tend to understand public opinion. Not just because it seemed like a much more interesting way to collect data compared to survey work, which, I'll freely admit is not my cup of tea. I can get bored with that quite quickly. But it also, I think, really drew attention to the fact that, we are social beings who make sense of our world and our place in it through conversation with others. And, previously I'd done quite a bit of work with the writings of Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, and this way of approaching kind of human beings and the self as a particular subject was really central to his way of thinking. So I was already kind of, predisposed to thinking about how people make sense of their meaning in their lives and such through conversation and what have you. And, Kathy Kramer just kind of put these two ideas together and really kind of made the point that, this is a great way to derive some insight into how, political opinion actually works, how people's political opinions form, how they form, why they form in the way they do. So that was kind of a long, rambly answer. But it was definitely my interest in this was definitely tied up in the fact that I'm from rural and had just recently returned back to rural, and I had encountered, this book by Kathy Kramer and, that explained this methodology that, got me quite excited.
And building off that, why Alberta? And I mean, the answer might be somewhat obvious for someone who's in Canadian politics and knows the concept of Western alienation. And so obviously you have back to the Reform Party and that large eruption in the late 90s, but from starting late 80s going to late 90s. So why Alberta, and what has changed or reemerged in the last few years that makes this work specifically relevant?
Well, my interest in doing this, at least initially in rural Alberta, wasn't actually related to the fact that Alberta politics, and especially rural Alberta politics, has this kind of unique history of being kind of really bizarre. I know that, and I've done previous work around that, but it was much more practical. I just moved back to rural Alberta, and I was working at the University of Alberta for an organization that focused on kind of rural Alberta questions. So that's what initially drew me to Alberta. It was close to home. It was, it wasn't going to cost a lot of money to do the project. That said, and, maybe we can talk about this later. I certainly have plans to do this beyond Alberta. What has changed in the last few years in Alberta? Like, obviously Alberta politics, throughout the pandemic and since has been quite explosive. And even, going back to the last 10, 15 years, it has been really volatile compared to, kind of the previous 100 years where it was almost the exact opposite of volatile. It was incredibly stable. What else, a lot of the most controversial things that have emerged out of Alberta politics, through the pandemic and onward, are certainly interesting and I think do make this work relevant. But it's worth noting, I actually completed this study in 2019, 3 years ago, but that also means it was done prior to the pandemic. So in some ways it feels like it was 10 years ago that I did this. And I often wonder, how different or how more exaggerated some of the responses would be had I done this 2 weeks ago rather than 3 years ago.
And in terms of the methodology and approach, I mean, you mentioned building on Kramer's work and kind of applying that kind of format to Alberta. What are some difficulties? I mean, obviously a lot of political literature is moving in the direction towards quant and statistical methods, and this is kind of a complete turn in the to the other extreme, so to speak, extreme qualitative work. So, how does that fit into, how do you think ethnography or political ethnography is relevant in a discipline that's increasingly going towards a stat-sided approach?
Yeah, fair question. Because I think, the paper, is clearly trying to, unveil some results with respect to political opinion in rural Alberta, but on a larger, or on a more broader scale, it's also just essentially making the case for political ethnography as an important tool to, understand political opinion. And it's certainly not going to replace survey work, nor should it. I didn't mean, just because I said earlier that, survey work kind of bores me. I certainly don't discount how important it is. And there's always going to be room for interviews and focus groups as well. And there are all kinds of, interesting experiments being developed by political opinion folks that can be hugely insightful. I certainly don't mean to suggest that political ethnography ought to, just kind of bump all this other stuff off and this is all we ought to be doing. But, I think having, a few more political scientists taking the time and effort to listen to people from different groups talk about politics or particular issues, can provide a lot of insight as well. I hope to have shown that by writing this paper. I don't know what else I would say about this. Is me just kind of talking out loud as opposed to giving an answer that needs to be on air. But maybe that's where I would leave that question now about methodology and how it relates to.
And I mean, it seems like something that would be quite. From a methodological perspective, as the political science conducting this work, there's a lot of unknowns, obviously, compared to survey work where you're very much setting up the type of responses you're going to get, or at least setting the menu for what type of responses you're going to get. Was this something you were nervous about doing? It's something you had to improve on over the process, or something you felt confident about going in? Like, and what were easy mistakes? That you wouldn't necessarily repeat a second time if you were to replicate a study like this?
Yeah, to your first question, I was not comfortable at all. I was terrified. I tell the story often to, some of my closer colleagues here that I still remember, my blood pressure going through the roof, sitting in my vehicle outside a McDonald's at 5:30 a.m., trying to work up the courage to actually, wander in and start this because, I'm a shy person as it is. I think that's probably a common trait amongst academics, maybe. But to just wander in and approach a group of strangers who, it wouldn't surprise me if they, had their own preconceptions about what an academic or what a professor might be like or what have you, and kind of approach them and have to say, hey, I'm a professor and I'd love to sit down and chat with you. It was hugely scary to be frank. But yeah, once you do it a few times, like everything, you get a little bit more comfortable with it. In terms of, things I've learned having gone through this, I'm sure there are lots of little mistakes I made in the moment. They're not necessarily coming to the forefront of my mind right now, but what I do, what does kind of jump out would be, just in terms of a lesson learned, how time-consuming this type of approach can be. Not just in the sense that, of course, you have to drive all over and find these communities and take the time to sit there and be part of these conversations, but also I don't think I quite recognized going in how much time, if you actually do this and sit there and be dedicated to just listening to the conversation play out, and like you do try and direct it at times to politics, but sometimes you're just going to sit there and listen to a 20-minute conversation about what's on sale at the local co-op or who won the local curling bond spiel. And it's not really your place. I think it would be kind of a violation of the approach to kind of jump in and be like, excuse me, I don't have time to hear about all the gossip about the curling bond spiel. I just want to hear about politics. So, you have to, be prepared for that. And, but it's such a relational approach too. So, understanding that and being able to not even listen, but engage with them. When they're talking about the curling bonspiel, you jump in and, oh, that's interesting, you being part of the conversation, because that's being able to put these folks at ease is really the key. That's the only way you're going to get to a point where they're going to start to be blunt about, how they think about politics and how they see all these different issues kind of at play. So there's the time commitment and what you're going to end up learning from these people and understanding how relational it is and how, you just have to figure out a way to engage in the conversation in a way that's going to put them at ease. And I think I probably got better at that as I went along. Maybe the first couple conversations, maybe I wasn't very good at that, but that would be a big lesson, I think, that I took away from this.
And speaking of putting people at ease, I actually quite enjoyed the kind of learning about ethnography a little more and understanding it as a method. But a critique I imagined was, especially with who you were interviewing, and not to get too personal, but, you would appear as someone that they would view as their in-group. And that's a very important part of the piece overall, is who they viewed as ordinary people and who they didn't. From a methods perspective, a lot of people might critique a method that if you subbed yourself out and someone else in, that they might view as an out group. It might not even be, some of the out groups that they showed distaste for, or people within the who you interviewed showed distaste for. It could also just be someone who's just been in a city their entire life, grew up in Toronto, and now they're coming to Alberta to talk. Even that simple level of out group, and getting different responses and maybe a different level of comfortability. So what do you have to say about ethnography in terms of maybe only certain academics can do it in certain settings, or do you disagree with that kind of critique?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I wouldn't ever just kind of try to brush that critique aside, because I think it's a very legitimate question. And I admit in the paper that me being from rural Alberta and even more so, me being able to credibly discuss things like farming or local community issues or whatever absolutely helps set these folks at ease. I'd be surprised if someone from, let's take the example of someone who just grew up in Toronto. What would happen if they showed up and tried to do what I did in rural Alberta? I'd be very surprised if that person was, openly rebuffed. I'd be surprised if the people, said, no, don't sit down. You jerk, get out of here. You're from Toronto. But I do certainly think that it would take a bit more for folks to become a little bit more comfortable. And this is where, we haven't really talked much about Kathy Kramer's work that inspired my own. She wrote this entire book. Her study, the key difference, there were a couple of differences, but the key difference between her study and what I did, even though I was essentially trying to replicate her approach, was she conducted her research over 2 or 3 years and visited these groups multiple times over that time frame. And she admitted I think she even describes herself as quote unquote as a city girl. She was from Madison, Wisconsin, the capital of the state, and going out to rural areas was a bit of an eye-opening experience for her. There definitely was a period where, there was probably a bit of dismissiveness on behalf of the groups when she was trying to kind of approach them. But she was able to kind of break through this by, visiting them multiple times over a couple of years. So, that's one way that I think you can overcome that potential hurdle if it's there. I don't think that, is a perfect solution. Who has that time to do this, to stretch a study out like this for a couple of years. And on the flip side, talking about methodology and critiquing the methodology, given that I was from rural Alberta, it puts me in a bit of a unique place in terms of interpreting what I was hearing. And I try to address this a bit in the paper as well. I think it'd be really interesting to see if someone from, say, Toronto, who barely set foot in a rural location ever, goes out and tries to do this in rural Alberta. It would be, assuming they get over kind of that initial hurdle and they can set folks at ease, would they have interpreted the answers in the same way I did? I think that's a fair question to ask, and I don't have the perfect answer to that question. And in fact, I'm just really curious to know if that was replicated in that way, what would the conclusions be in that case?
Right. Do you feel also though that one of the benefits of the method is that you're adding a more conversational human look at respondents rather than survey work? But do you think that has an impact on you as the researcher and building these, even if they're temporary relationships with people, in terms of bias is a strong word. If you could water down bias a little bit, because bias sounds very negative in connotation, but in terms of that process, it's something that's unique to the method that you might not necessarily have in survey work or working with big data sets. And
yeah, and I don't know if I would go as far as bias, but maybe a term I would use would be sympathetic, right? It wasn't that difficult for me to end up in a situation where once you hear these folks talk about their own struggles, their own perceived grievances and what have you, it's hard not to be, as a researcher, somewhat sympathetic to these situations. And, I happen to know, just from other research that I've done, that, rural communities by and large have struggled across the Western world the last, number of years. There's been all kinds of different trends of decline in terms of job opportunities and government services available and such. So there are, legitimate things that I think rural folks can, complain about or feel kind of shortchanged around. Now, if someone, so sure, maybe I'm feeling some sympathy towards them when they're describing this, and it's helping me make a little bit more sense of how they're jumping from I feel aggrieved to why is the federal government consistently, trying to reach out and create positive outcomes for Indigenous communities? Why aren't they doing that for my community too? I can see the connections they're making while and being sympathetic at the same time, not necessarily agreeing with their conclusions and thinking that actually there are legitimate reasons why, government is reaching out to Indigenous communities in these particular ways and such. And they're not on, the same plane in terms of grievance, necessarily. But yes, the sympathy thing is a part of this.
And kind of just as you mentioned, taking the different connections along the line of where they start with their grievances and the conclusions they make, that's kind of one of the main outcomes or findings of the paper. But was there anything that surprised you specifically in trends in what people said? Kind of transitioning away from a methods discussion and more of a findings discussion. But from my underconceptions of populist literature and discussing the real identity, a lot of what they said followed along majority of what the literature says. It's just, but was there any new areas or trends that you saw that surprised you?
Well, there are probably two things I would throw out, and although the first one isn't new at all, it's quite old, but it surprised me that it was still there in the same way, and that is how deeply held kind of the anti-politician and especially anti-party sentiment was in these conversations in almost every single group without any prompting. Folks raised the issue of party discipline and the power of the leader over the local MLA, and just how angry that made them, that their local MLA, who was presumably, the best equipped to represent their concerns in caucus, was, in their words, useless. That's literally the terminology that I heard a number of different times. Our local MLA is useless. And a number of people, again, across different groups, came out and suggested, this is blatantly anti-democratic. Politics would be far better off if we got rid of parties altogether. Now, so in saying this, they're obviously advancing a way of thinking about representation that, clearly rubs up against the Westminster system. And I know from, my previous work and, some of the listeners who know a bit about Alberta politics and Alberta populism and the history of it, might know that, there's nothing in this that's new. The United Farmers of Alberta was talking about getting rid of parties and ensuring, local MLAs had this power, 100 years ago. And the Reform Party and Preston Manning was, it was the big, the thing that made them the most popular in Western Canada was kind of this pledge to be a grassroots-driven party. So it's always been there, but to be honest, it surprised me how deeply it was still there, because we haven't heard too much about it lately, and especially the anti-party stuff. How many people told me, we tend to assume Rural Albertans, are just, go to bed wearing their Conservative Party pajamas, like they're so ingrained with the Conservative Party. And no doubt many of them lean conservative ideologically, but most of them, I think, would rather have no political party, no political parties in the system, as opposed to having a Conservative Party in power. Because when the Conservative Party is in power, all they see is the leader, failing to empower kind of local MLA. So the extent of that sentiment surprised me. It really did. And it's left me thinking a lot about Alberta politics today and, consecutive premiers, Conservative premiers running into problems and having to, resign. We just went through another one of these recently in Alberta with Jason Kenney. And, there's this assumption, and I don't think it's necessarily wrong, that there's this divide in, provincial Conservative Party between kind of center-right and hard-right folks in the party. That is there. But I think a lot of folks are missing out how a lot of rural folks just really believe their local MLA ought not to have to follow, party discipline. And when they do kind of have to be, shepherded into line, that really bothers rural folks, more so than I think people realize. So that would, I think, be the kind of the central surprise in terms of, the findings that I speak about in the paper. But one other surprise that, I guess maybe shouldn't have surprised me, but did, and I can deal with this one much, much more quickly. Despite the fact that when I approached these groups, there was a lot of, kind of groaning and eye rolling when I said, hey, I'm a political scientist from the U of A. I'd love to sit down and talk politics with you. There's a lot of groaning to that, but it didn't take long before, folks in pretty much all of these groups were expressing a deep appreciation to me for taking the time to listen to them. I was not anticipating that at all. I thought it would be me at the end saying, thank you so much for your time. And of course I did thank them for their time, but that sense of simply, not being listened to was so pervasive that even me sitting there, someone who, I don't, in their eyes, I guess, because I was, a political scientist from the university, I must have some sort of stature. I'd never really thought of myself in that way necessarily. But for them, it was really meaningful that, and I use this quote, I think, in the paper, that someone that mattered sat down and took the time to listen to them. That the consistent way in which that reappeared in their comments surprised me.
How much do you think being heard could reduce political disenfranchisement, or and maybe what ways do you think it would take for them to be meaningfully heard to do that?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question. And I don't have, necessarily a great answer to that, but I do think, if there are any real world kind of political implications to this work, they probably lie in that direction, in the sense that there is this segment of the population that feels unheard, that feels no one's listening to them, that feels they are being left behind. Not everything they told me was factually correct. They misunderstood certain things. I think in certain places maybe they exaggerated the ways in which they are being, mistreated. But that sense is there is really important. And when, to the degree that this is possible. So in policy debates or education around issues, education around Indigenous issues, thinking about maintaining, national unity, trying to overcome, separatist sentiments, things like that. I do think there's room to somehow try to tailor the message when you're speaking to rural folks in Alberta. Try to tailor the message in a way that at least acknowledges, I understand you're feeling this grievance. I understand you're feeling unheard. Is that going to solve everything with the snap of a finger? Probably not. But I think that kind of approach, there's probably some potential to lower some temperatures around certain political issues that I think could be helpful.
And Alberta's kind of conceived of as being the most disenfranchised of the at least the Western provinces. And you mentioned earlier replicating this potentially in other places, other provinces. Do you have any hypotheses about, how it might be different, how it might be the same? Maybe stick to Western provinces, but then even how it might be different if you just did rural people Ontario, so you don't have that Western alienation, but you still have that, the shrinking of rural towns and the decay of rural communities, kind of across North America being a trend, right?
Yeah, so absolutely. And I'll quickly throw in that I was lucky enough to be awarded a SSHRC IDG grant just this summer that's going to allow myself and a colleague, Dr. Dion Polar from the University of Saskatchewan, to do just this. We have some money now that we're going to expand this and do this in other rural communities across Canada, which I'm, super excited about. What am I anticipating finding? I think you're exactly right that on one hand, provinces have, and I am a believer in this, provinces by and large have kind of some unique political cultures. They obviously have unique political histories, unique grievances and what have you. So of course, in rural Ontario, you're not going to have, the same Western alienation or what have you. But I think you put your finger on something important in the sense that, again, rural communities across the Western world have been, facing a few different trends of decline. And it would surprise me if those types of things didn't come up in these conversations. And, a sense of, again, kind of being left behind. Maybe no one's listening to our calls for help or our pleas, that, hey, we are being left behind, or there aren't as many opportunities, or, there aren't as many government services as there used to be before. We now have to drive an hour, 2 hours to see a doctor. Our kids have to ride the bus an hour or two to get to school. This is unfair. It wouldn't surprise me if there is some, resentment rooted in those types of feelings in other communities. But again, I'm just guessing. We're going to start doing some of this work shortly, hopefully, this spring, summer. I don't think it would be, exactly the same, but it wouldn't surprise me if some similar things emerge.
Do you think, so I'm going back to methodology a little bit here, but, the impact, and you touched on this previously, of COVID and all of the lockdown versus vaccine mandate debates, all of that, do you think now that doing this is like a province like Saskatchewan, how much do you think that has had an effect on the disenfranchisement and the resentment within these rural communities, and potentially an increase you see in surprising in Saskatchewan, compared to Alberta before, COVID happened? Sorry, I'm kind of asking multiple questions at once there, but, do you have any thoughts on that kind of line of thinking?
I've probably been giving you multiple answers all along as well. So I think no doubt COVID and the pandemic and everything that has come along with that will have, kind of supercharged some of this stuff, especially given how, certain entities in the United States and now in Canada are really trying to capitalize on, some uncertainty, some insecurity, some fear, some anger at certain policies, and really kind of throwing that right back at folks and creating this kind of echo chamber that is seemingly getting people even angrier. So yes, I think that, post-COVID, I think there will be, potentially more rage that emerges in these types of conversations. But, and I will pause and say, as someone who is from rural but studies rural, there is kind of this overarching narrative that, rural is anti-vax and anti-lockdown and anti-science. And that is a gross over-exaggeration. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but, throughout almost all rural communities, 70 to 80% of folks went out and got the first two vaccines and, stayed home from, the hardware store or whatever when they were asked to, and tried to play their role as well. There were obviously some pretty vocal, opposition that emerged from rural areas, but there was a lot of vocal opposition to this kind of stuff that came from urban areas too, that somehow just kind of gets swept under the rug, and it's kind of just a rural issue. But on the other hand, and again, this isn't an iron rule, but rural folks across Canada tend to lean a little bit more conservative than urban folks. And that has implications in the sense that so much of, the conservative media, especially kind of the alternative conservative media related to, that you find, I don't know how alternative Fox News is, but, if you lean conservative, you're going to end up, consuming more conservative based media. So Fox News, the Sun, Rebel Media, this stuff online or what have you. And I think that is being consumed maybe at higher levels in rural areas than urban, just because there are more conservatives than there are in urban areas. And that, I think, is, again, kind of sending a jolt through rural communities. The conversations are changing. Some of the rhetoric is getting a little bit more radical. But again, I wouldn't say that's a majority of rural people, but there is definitely a contingent of rural folk that across Canada that have almost become a little bit more radicalized because they're consuming this, alternative conservative media and everything that came with that through, first Trump and then the January 6th thing in the United States and everything that's coming out of the media around that. And now the pandemic, especially, and the misinformation around all of that.
That's a good way to put it. Kind of ending off here. Before we finish up, I did a little bit of reading of some of your other work and talking about the idea of protecting or creating this rural identity, in a similar light to how, and tell me if I'm interpreting it wrong here, in similar light to how other groups within Canada have a kind of protected status, and maybe not to the same extent, but do you, and theorizing about that a little bit, do you think that can be used to alleviate some of this discontent and some urban decay, and what, in a post-pandemic kind of scenario, how do you think that might become important, or is it less important now?
Yeah, good question. And the work you're referring to is, I think, can quickly be characterized, if read out of context, as kind of controversial. I've had people suggest, are you suggesting that, rural folks have suffered the same grievances as Indigenous folks? And, this is, I'm not saying anything of the like. Mostly what I've written, in other places is I do think this notion of rural identity is real. I think that for a lot of people who grew up in rural communities, remaining in rural and living that rural lifestyle is very, very important to them, very important to their way of being there as a human being. And I've pointed out, drawing on some of this, literature around communal rights and preservation of cultures and things like that, are there certain instances where kind of an urban majority is via policy kind of making it harder for rural communities to persevere. And if so, maybe those are areas where we can talk about, rural as an identity that ought not to just be, unthinkingly run over by the majority. Now, what that looks like, it would be different from issue to issue, but even, I think just even acknowledging rural as an identity and why that's important for rural people, again, has the potential to kind of lower some temperatures, just in the same way that, acknowledging that, some rural folks feel like they haven't been listened to for a long time, or they're often kind of the butt of the joke of kind of the sophisticated urbanite or something like that. Kind of just bringing that awareness into the conversation, I think has, again, some potential to lower some temperatures around some of these, conversations that have become, needlessly incendiary.
And last question here, going back to Alberta, and this is kind of related to, a rural identity, but Alberta has, at least in my conception of themselves politically, as a province, has tried to assert itself more and maybe take on some strategies Quebec used to differentiate itself as a province. After speaking to the response you did in the interview style, or the conversation style, I should say, do you feel that Alberta asserting itself more is easing these anxieties or magnifying them? And is that how helpful do you think that is as a path forward, at least for Albertans' disenfranchisement, as Alberta tries to assert itself politically as a province more?
Yeah, good question. Even though there are definitely citizens in rural Alberta who would cheer this type of thing on, ferociously, right? Standing up to Trudeau, standing up to Ottawa. I actually don't think that is the solution. I think largely because, I have no problem saying, I think a lot of the so-called grievances that our provincial government has been trying to kind of ring the bell on aren't legitimate grievances at all. I don't actually think that Alberta has been mistreated in this huge, scary way that, a lot of these proponents want to show. And also, the solutions, these proposed solutions from, holding a referendum to end the equalization formula, or, Daniel Smith now, pledging that, the Sovereignty Act, whatever it means, she's given different versions to different audiences what exactly she means by Sovereignty Act. But this notion that somehow the Alberta government is going to just, only enforce the federal laws that it feels are in its interest. None of this is legitimate. None of this is, possible unless we're actually talking about separatism. But assuming we're not quite talking about separatism, I think, stoking, and that's what provincial governments for decades and decades in Alberta have purposely stoked this message that Ottawa's screwing you over. It's our job to stand up to protect you. And that's really where their political base, where they draw the kind of the strong support they do, is in this, playing this role of protector against Ottawa. It's more about that than it is actually about conservative ideology. But they stoke these messages, and these messages have been gobbled up by, folks in rural areas, that it's Trudeau's fault. If only Trudeau was gone, or if only Ottawa treated us differently, all our problems would go away, which is baloney. It's not true. But in stoking that and then pledging, we're going to get rid of the equalization formula because we had a provincial referendum on it, or we're going to just ignore federal laws. Like all of that is nonsensical. It's not going to work. But if people are buying in and saying, okay, we're supporting Daniel Smith because she's really going to stand up and ignore these federal laws, what comes next when this doesn't work? When the Supreme Court actually said, no, you can't do this. So then, it almost leads necessarily to ratcheting things up even higher. So now we're like, okay, I guess we're on the fast track to separatism. So that was a long and rambly way of suggesting that I don't think the way to kind of bring down the temperature in rural Alberta or have people feel less resentment in rural Alberta is by, this getting tough with Ottawa strategy. I don't think that's the path.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I think that's a great place to end because it almost inspires a few more questions rather than answers. And so, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm excited to see some of this work unfold as you kind of conduct these kind of ethnographic work in the future.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Insights, a Canadian Journal of Political Science podcast. This was Clark Banack discussing the topic of ethnography and rural Alberta identity. For future episodes, follow us on Twitter at CJPS_RCSP, or subscribe to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. If you want to support the CJPS and its podcast, we welcome any distribution of our episodes and further reading of the articles discussed. We hope that Insights by the CJPS will be a valuable resource for teaching political science and will inspire you to read the full article in detail. Thank you for listening.